You're in a meeting. Someone is presenting a plan. People around the table are all nodding along. And about 3 minutes in, you can already see the issue. Not a small one, the kind that will surface later and create a much bigger problem. You can see exactly where it is, and you could explain it in one, maybe two sentences. But you pause. Not because you're unsure, because you're calculating something else first. How will that sentence land? Who it will expose? Who it will contradict? Who might feel cornered? And suddenly the decision in front of you isn't just, is this accurate? It becomes, is this politically survivable to say out loud? If you've been leading long enough, you've probably felt this moment. It usually arrives much later in a career than people expect. Not when you're still learning leadership, but when you've become experienced enough to see systems clearly. Welcome to Soul Fire Leadership. This is where we talk about the internal side of leadership that rarely gets named. The patterns that show up after you've already proven yourself. The ones experienced leaders recognize immediately once someone finally says them out loud. Today, I want to talk about a moment many leaders start navigating. The moment when your insight becomes a little politically dangerous. One of the things that happens as leaders gain experience is that their pattern recognition speeds up. You don't need the entire presentation. You don't need all 12 or 24 slides. Somewhere, maybe around slide 3 or 5, you already understand the trajectory. You've seen this movie before. You know how this kind of decision tends to unfold, where the pressure points will appear, where the unintended consequences will surface. From the outside, this looks like strategic thinking, but internally, it often feels simpler than that. You're just noticing something earlier than most people in the room. And early in a career, that's usually welcome. You speak up. You point something out. The room adjusts. Problem avoided. Everyone moves on. And later in leadership, something subtle starts changing because the insight itself isn't the only variable anymore. The room becomes one too. At a certain level of leadership, accuracy starts interacting with hierarchy. Your observation might be technically correct, but saying it might expose a flawed assumption in someone else's strategy. It might contradict a senior stakeholder's narrative. It might highlight a risk that someone else has already publicly committed to ignoring. And that's when leadership becomes more complex than simply speaking truth. Now, there's another calculation happening. Not, is this accurate? But what does this sentence rearrange if I say it? Does it create clarity? Or does it destabilize a political balance in the room that the room is quietly maintaining? Many experienced leaders start noticing this moment. The pause. the internal scan, where insight meets consequence. Once you've seen that dynamic a few times, you naturally start adjusting. Not dramatically, just slightly. You phrase things a little differently. You soften the edges of an observation. You ask a question instead of stating a conclusion. You introduce a concern indirectly instead of naming the issue directly. From the outside, this looks like diplomacy, and sometimes it genuinely is. But something else can start happening over time. You begin editing how much of what you see actually reaches the room. Not because you're afraid, because you're experienced enough to understand the ripple effects. And that quiet filtering process becomes part of leadership itself. What makes this moment difficult is that it's rarely discussed openly, because technically nothing is wrong. You're still respected, still influential, still making sound decisions, but internally, something feels different. You're seeing things earlier, more clearly, more structurally, and sometimes that clarity has nowhere clean to go. You can't say everything you see. You shouldn't say everything you see. So leadership becomes partly about deciding which truths are useful to surface and which one the system isn't ready to absorb yet. And that can feel strangely isolating. Not dramatic. It's like you're holding pieces of a puzzle that don't always have an obvious place on the table. One of the surprising things about senior leadership is that wisdom isn't just about insight. It's about timing, knowing when clarity will create movement and when it will simply create resistance, knowing which observation opens a conversation and which one shuts it down. This is where leadership becomes less about being right and more about being effective. Sometimes that means saying the sentence. Sometimes it means letting the room discover the insight 10 minutes later on their own. Not because you're withholding truth, because you're guiding the system towards seeing it. If you've ever sat in a meeting watching a conversation unfold, already knowing where the real issue is and wondering, do I say it now or do I wait? You're not alone in that moment. Many experienced leaders quietly navigate this exact tension. The ability to see clearly and the responsibility to decide how much clarity a room can actually use. Leadership eventually stops being only about insight. It becomes what you do with the insight once you have it. And that's a much more nuanced skill than most leadership books ever talk about. If conversations like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep exploring the internal parts of leadership that experienced leaders recognize immediately once they finally have a name.